I would like to ask Lisbeth Gronlund, Laura Grego, and Kelsey Davenport to come up on the stage. Lisbeth is a senior scientist and co-director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She focuses on technical and policy issues related to U.S. nuclear weapons, ballistic missile defenses, and space weapons.
I want to thank you all for coming. It's a really nice crowd and a really nice venue, I have to say. Thank you to the organizers. This is a beautiful space. And I am going, there's sort of two things that we need to do to get out of this mess. One is we need to get rid of the weapons, and so far, U.S. and Soviet and U.S. and Russian arms control has focused on the numbers of some kinds of weapons. But there are other things we can do over here in parallel that will make the chance of nuclear war, nuclear use, less likely. And we've heard previous speakers talk about some of those things, about the possibility of a false alarm leading to a mistaken nuclear war, really. And I won't be talking about that, but there is a kind of a fact sheet over there about that issue. There's also the question of the president's sole authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. I'm not going to talk about that either, but there is also a piece of paper over there. What I'm going to talk about is U.S. has a policy of using nuclear weapons first, so it seems kind of obvious. You don't want to start one by accident. You don't want to start one deliberately. So here we go, I think. Okay, it's still flashing, but that's okay. So the U.S. has always reserved the right to use nuclear weapons first. That's what it says, reserve the right. And not only has it reserved the right, during the Cold War, it was part of its policy. The NATO and the U.S. believed that Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, had superior conventional forces. So the policy was explicitly to use nuclear weapons to counter a conventional invasion of Western Europe, should one occur. At its peak, the U.S. had 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe of all kinds. We had bombs, we had short-range missiles, we even had nuclear artillery, and this is a photo of a test of a nuclear artillery in the U.S. with a real warhead. That the distance between that artillery gun you see there on the right and the explosion on the left is about 10 kilometers. That's about how far it went, 6 miles. It had a yield of about 15 kilotons, which is 15 kilo is 1,000. 15,000 tons equivalent of TNT, which is about the size of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. So, you know, not really that small. So, in fact, the first 25 years of the nuclear age, the U.S. had absolutely no constraints on the use of nuclear weapons. It didn't even think about it. In fact, it considered using nuclear weapons first against countries without nuclear weapons several times during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, during the Taiwan Strait crises. And only when we get to negotiating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does the U.S. think about, oh, maybe we need to put some constraints on what we might do with our, under what circumstances we might use our nuclear weapons first. So just to remind folks, if you don't know, the Non-Proliferation Treaty basically grandfathered in the 5 nuclear weapon states. The US, Soviet Union, China, France, and Britain were allowed to keep their nuclear weapons, but they had to get moved towards disarmament. All the other countries said, we won't get them. But there was a concern that, well, maybe these other countries wouldn't want to give up that option if they were threatened to have nuclear weapons used against them. And so what they really wanted was to have some kind of guarantee in the treaty itself, which they failed to get, but there was, the 5 nuclear-armed states did sort of indicate general opposition to using nuclear weapons against these non-nuclear countries in a Security Council resolution. Okay, we're moving in that direction, not very fast. And then, for the first time, the US actually makes a clear statement under the Carter administration that we will not use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state in compliance with what did I just do? Yeah. Unless there's an except in response to an attack, if you are allied with or associated with a nuclear weapon state. So in other words, this applied to the Warsaw Pact nations. Okay, so the US would consider using nuclear weapons first against a Warsaw Pact nation because they were in alliance with the Soviet Union, which had nuclear weapons. Okay, now it doesn't say anything about under what conditions we would use nuclear weapons against nuclear armed states. That comes later. Okay, so Bush too, he doesn't negate this policy publicly, but his nuclear posture review was leaked, and it specifically talked about using nuclear weapons first against Russia and China. Okay, you'd expect that. North Korea, which had not been in compliance with the NPT for, this is really fuzzy here, 1993. And then several countries that did not have nuclear weapons and were in compliance with the NPT. So that's the part that they didn't want to say publicly. And they say, why? Why would you do this? In response to a biological, chemical, conventional attack, but also in response to surprising military developments, which is big blanket right there. Okay, now we get to Obama. Okay, so he takes out that clause about, if you're a country allied with a nuclear weapon state, all bets are off. So he just says, United States will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are in compliance with the NPT. There's a little asterisk, though. The U.S. reserves the right, there's always this reserves the right, to change this policy if bioweapons become a bigger thing. Okay, so it also talks about under what conditions would the U.S. use nuclear weapons first against countries that have nuclear weapons. So Russia, China, and North Korea. Iran fell into this category because it was not in full compliance with the NPT until quite recently, 2016. And since then, it's been, off that list, but only in extreme circumstances and in a narrow range of contingencies. So it's saying we are trying to shrink this, and ultimately, we want to have a no first use policy that basically says we don't care who you are or what you do, we're not going to use nuclear weapons first. Okay, now interestingly, so this was 2010, they weren't able to say that then. By the end of Obama's second administration, he and Biden had decided, yes, the US should be ready to do this. They ran into opposition from members of their administration, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, who said they did not think that we had really discussed this with our allies and we were not ready to do it. And we can talk more about that later. Okay, so now we have President Trump also issues a nuclear posture review last year, and he repeats word for word the negative security assurance. And remember, there was an asterisk under Obama. Well, there's one here too, which is a little broader. Again, the U.S. reserves the right to change this policy. Right. If non-nuclear strategic attack technologies, so remember the other one was biological weapons, this is quite broad, could be anything really, becomes, right, so it's not just bioweapons, it's other things. It could be cyber weapons, it could be anything. Again, he retains Obama's policy. Only in extreme circumstances would the U.S. use nuclear weapons against nuclear weapon states. But he expands what that means. What is an extreme circumstance? Well, it could be attacks on U.S. or allied population or infrastructure, like maybe the electric grid. It could be attacks, and these are non-nuclear attacks, right? That's on U.S. or allied nuclear forces, their command and control, attack assessment capabilities, could be a radar. So again, it's a pretty broad spectrum of things. So let me talk about, so in part of the discussion, there's this sort of sense of, well, we don't want to take anything off the table. Why would you do that? And a sort of sense of, well, this, last resort, you might want to use nuclear weapons. They're kind of in the closet, and then we would pull them out. But that's not the case, okay? I talked about how they were integral to U.S. and NATO policy during the Cold War. And that's still much less so, but this, the U.S. Plans for and prepares for the use of nuclear weapons first. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about nuclear warfighting, which there was a really good definition of this in President Trump's nuclear posture review. For a regional conflict, nuclear warfighting refers to using nuclear weapons in an ongoing way once a conventional conflict has expanded to include nuclear weapons. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Oopsie daisy. So I said that we once had 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe. It's down to about 150. Did I get that wrong? Does this say 50? Okay. I'm actually about to get cataract surgery, which will be awesome. But in the meanwhile, things are a little blurry. So the U.S. has, for a long time, and now it's reduced, bombs at NATO bases in 5 countries. They are guarded by American soldiers. But if there was a decision to use them, they would be handed over to the Air Force of the host country, and their pilots and their aircraft would deliver them. Okay, so this is a photo of a fighter aircraft dropping a B-61 bomb, a dummy B-61 bomb. The bomb itself has variable yields from 0.3 kilotons, which is 2% of the yield of the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima, up to, and we have 5 and 10 and 50. So on one end, when people talk about nuclear warfighting, they generally talk about tactical nuclear weapons, which means generally that they are delivered on they're short range, okay? So this is not a long-range bomber, this is a short-range fighter. And they generally mean small in yield, but as you can see, this one has, 50 kilotons is not small. So the U.S. and NATO do nuclear exercises. They're called Steadfast Noon, and that it basically allows the countries, the air forces of these countries that have these weapons, to conduct mock nuclear strikes using, again, their aircraft and their pilots which both increases readiness and also sends a pretty clear signal to Russia that, hey, we're ready to go. And here's a photo of German Tornado pilots with a mock warhead loading it onto their aircraft. So under Obama, he says, well, actually, this is an Obama official who was speaking at a conference and says, we're working to effectively integrate conventional and nuclear planning and operations. For too long, crossing the nuclear threshold was thought to move a conventional conflict into the nuclear realm. Okay, but that's not true, he says. By making sure our forces are capable of continuing to fight following a limited nuclear war. Okay, so it's not gone. We're still doing the troops in the middle of the nuclear weapons. We preserve flexibility for the president. Okay. So Trump continues this and kind of adds to it. Again, the U.S. will strengthen integration of nuclear and non-nuclear military planning. Says that this will allow us to operate in the face of nuclear threats and employment. Of course, it goes both ways. It would also allow U.S. forces to operate in the case the U.S. use nuclear weapons first. Okay, so this is very much part of U.S. military planning, right? It's not, these weapons are not in the closet, all right? They're not something you would pull out under extreme circumstances. No, we are exercising with them, with our NATO allies, and it's really part of. Okay, so let's go back to the bottom line, which is, you remember all those countries that are members in good standing of the NPT. Currently, we're not going to use nuclear weapons. Maybe in the future, biological weapons issues. That leaves North Korea, China, and Russia. And as I said for a while, Iran. All those countries have nuclear weapons. So if we use nuclear weapons first, they certainly have the option of retaliating. I think you'd have to expect retaliation. And now we have a nuclear war. Okay, so this is not in the US interests. Okay, our policy is a threat to us. And their good news, I'm going to end with some good news, which is there is a bill both in the House and the Senate. Senator Warren, Representative Adam Smith simply says it is the policy of the United States to not use nuclear weapons first. It's something that our organization and others are trying to inject no first use into the presidential campaign. We have some bird dogging operations in New Hampshire and Idaho. Not only has Senator Warren spoken about this, but Senator Gillibrand has been talking about this. And so our hope is that by getting some focused attention during the presidential campaign, that we can elevate this a little more. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Laura is a senior scientist in the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program. She focuses her analysis and advocacy on the technology and security dimensions of ballistic missile defense and of outer space security.
As you've heard many times today, the world has been living under the threat of nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles since the 1950s. And two nuclear-armed nations, the Soviet Union, later Russia, and the United States, have been desperate to deter the other from using these weapons and tried to by threatening retaliation. That was the logic. But once they began to develop early defenses against ballistic missiles, both countries responded by building more missiles than the other could destroy, and by arming each of those missiles with multiple warheads. The development of more and powerful missiles allowed them to carry multiple nuclear weapons at a time, and the arsenals expanded rapidly, up to a peak of over 60,000 weapons. So this is just this is data from the Federation of American Scientists, who keep track of the nuclear stockpiles over time. It might be a little hard to see the timeline on this, but the scale is at you can see 60,000 at the top, that's in the 1980s. Certainly enough to destroy human civilization many times over. The goal of these expansions were many, but at least one was to overwhelm any defenses the other country might be able to mount. So this action and reaction cycle resulted in the rapidly growing potential for mass destruction. Eventually, U.S. and Soviet leaders recognized the dangers of this action and reaction cycle, and in 1972, they signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited strategic arms, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which Dan Ellsberg mentioned in his remarks. Both countries realized that the ABM Treaty, which strictly limited defenses against long-range missiles, was crucial to limiting offensive arms. So those two things had to go together. It was meant to serve to break the cycle of every defensive advance prompting the other side to improve its offense. These arms control agreements and those that followed eventually did the job and reduced those high numbers of nuclear weapons down to about a sixth of what they were at the peak. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which, quote, prohibited the development of ABM systems for the defense of the nation's entire territory, kept deployed hardware extremely limited and kept research and development to a relatively low level. That treaty held for 30 years, even through the watershed moments of something that some people in this audience will remember. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan announcing his intention to build a comprehensive missile defense system that would render nuclear weapons obsolete. This initiative, Strategic Defense Initiative, also called Star Wars, was an expansive effort to protect the entire United States against a full-scale attack of long-range ballistic missiles. That concept originally included pretty fantastic physics, including nuclear weapon-pumped X-ray lasers based in space, and it was really focused on the unachievable goal of providing an impenetrable barrier against the huge Soviet arsenal. As cost estimates increased and the technical challenges mounted, eventually the Reagan administration and the following administrations scaled back the plans. But research and development on strategic missile defenses continue to evolve and change names, eventually coming back to Earth to concentrate on ground-based interceptors. But it wasn't until 2001 that the ABM Treaty would eventually yield. The George W. Bush administration, citing a potentially growing threat from North Korea, announced that the U.S. would withdraw from the ABM Treaty, which would allow it to rush ahead with a plan to build a strategic missile defense system, which would include interceptors at sites in Alaska and in California within 2 years. So after 30 years of very limited strategic missile defenses, we would get one in the ground within 2 years. It was, of course, in the political environment following the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the start of the War on Terror. So opponents of missile defense found it very difficult to argue against any military programs, and Congress could only muster extremely limited debate on arms control in general. So at this point, the era of negotiated limits on missile defenses was over. So what did this lead to? Well, essentially, the next part of my talk, I'll essentially explain it's a technical fantasy that we can escape nuclear vulnerability using technical solutions. But the era of walking away from the ABM Treaty also led to some unexamined assumptions about what technology can do to make us safe. But the eventual hardware that was built started by the Bush administration was called the GroundBased Midcourse Defense System. And that was built, intended to defend the U.S. the 50 states against attack not from the huge Soviet or Russian arsenals, but long-range missiles from countries such as North Korea or Iran. Those missiles would be launched, of course, from thousands of miles away in an arced trajectory that takes them through space before they re-enter the atmosphere and fall to their targets under the force of gravity. But it was a rushed system, and the administration, in fact, loosened a lot of the rules about good engineering and fly-before-you-buy procedures to get something, to pour concrete, get something into the ground. So it has a lot of shortcomings, and it still is yet to demonstrate a useful military capability. Despite that, the system was declared operational at the end of 2004. So we're just coming up on its 15-year anniversary. In 2004, there were only 5 interceptors in place. But today, 15 years after the system was declared to be operational, it's still undergoing what are essentially development tests. In fact, it was just a couple of weeks ago that the first test that was called operational, meaning something that would have the actual military staff operating the system, that was the first time they've tested it in conditions that approached more operational. So this is a set of graphs. So the greens are successful intercept tests, and the red bars are failures. And this is cumulative. So you could look at a year like 2006 and see how many failures there had been at that point and how many successes. So as you can see, the record has been about 50-50, and it really hasn't improved. Right? Something that you're building that's getting better might have failures at the beginning, but you get in your stride. The system has consistently found challenges and has just basically does not provide a working defense. The record of the system is not the only problem. Actually, the tests that have been conducted have been extremely simplified under conditions much less complex and stressing than a real-world nuclear attack. For example, no test has included complex countermeasures of the type that you would expect from an adversary with a technical capability to build a nuclear weapon and an ICBM. They could build, for example, lightweight decoys that looked just like a warhead to all the sensors that we have. So if you're using your radars and your infrared sensors and you're looking at what's coming toward you, the system has to either figure out what is the heavy, dangerous warhead amongst decoys or target all of them. That's essentially. So this is a picture of another countermeasures strategy, which is using a bunch of lightweight balloons of different sizes and reflectivities and putting the actual targeted warhead inside one of them. So the defense would have to figure out amongst dozens, perhaps, of objects what's the actual object. So the previous slide explained that the reliability of the system wasn't very good. This is the next step, which is, can it work in the real world? And it's not been tested this way. An adversary could easily overwhelm the system. And this is a reality that's been known for decades. This isn't new news. This isn't new physics. This has been well known, but we continue to invest in a system like this. The reason I spent this time is to just explain the limits of technical solutions and why it's a problem. Of course, it is a waste of time and money, but it was a pretext for ending the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which had tremendous value, but it's also dangerous in other ways. For example, For example, there are more critical and pressing risks, such as in 2017, North Korea had tested its first long-range missiles and soon followed up with a test of what appeared to be a powerful hydrogen bomb. Conditions were approaching crisis levels. But President Trump told Americans not to worry. He said, "We build the greatest military equipment in the world." He said this on Fox News in October. We have missiles that can knock out another missile in the air 97% of the time. If you send 2 of them, no problem, they're going to get knocked down. So I don't know if the president was misinformed or misunderstood. In fact, most people would assume if we'd spent $43 billion on the system, that existed for 15 years, that it would provide protection and would act accordingly. In fact, the umbrella is broken. It does not provide protection. So my concern, of course, is that the unfounded belief in missile defense's ability to defend can make military actions against North Korea more appealing to decision makers, or act more aggressively in a crisis, or take more risks. So while creating a defensive umbrella has some natural appeal, defenses generally sound good, missile defenses can counterintuitively actually increase nuclear risks. As I just mentioned, the costs include the risk that a false sense of security might distort decision making. Believing that missile defense provides meaningful defense without a clear understanding of the system's limits, so you have to have good briefing, you have to understand your system, could lead decision makers to make a more aggressive foreign policy. It might increase support for a preemptive attack against North Korea. And it might also divert energy that would be better spent on political and diplomatic initiatives, because, of course, nuclear-armed missiles are a political issue that technical approaches are not going to solve. An additional cost associated with the GMD system and the other missile defense systems that the U.S. is building is that a significant buildup of the system, which we are entering an era of expansion beyond the existing 44 interceptors, can lead to concerns in Russia, but in particularly China, which has a much smaller nuclear arsenal, about the credibility of their nuclear deterrence. The unconstrained development of strategic missile defense is therefore a hindrance to efforts to limit nuclear weapons through arms control initiatives. I know that currently arms control is in dire straits, but we hope that we'll get our footing back and that we'll, again, once more be able to start to limit nuclear arms. In the presence of an enormous defensive capability, even if it doesn't work very well, has the potential for really capping progress there. For example, when the U.S. withdrew from the ABM treaty, the U.S. and Russia were able to secure one more round of nuclear arms reductions under New START, but then in those negotiations, Russia was very clear that it would not discuss another round of nuclear reductions without discussing limits on missile defenses. U.S. policy is strictly that we will not consider limits on missile defense. In fact, building ballistic missile defenses creates incentives not just to not participate in arms control, but for Russia and China to increase the size and sophistication of their nuclear weapons arsenals. As Dan Ellsberg mentioned in his remarks, last March, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced plans to field several new nuclear systems that are designed to evade U.S. missile defenses. Those include the nuclear-armed underwater drone that he talked about, a nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered cruise missile, and a hypersonic weapon. So the top corner image is a rendering of a hypersonic weapon from Russian news. But the bottom corner image is of a MIRV system. A MIRV is the arming of a single missile with a number of independent reentry vehicles, a number of different nuclear weapons. For example, China has begun to build more long-range missiles too. It's not just Russia, and to develop hypersonic weapons and to deploy multiple warheads on its missiles. It has also discussed putting its missiles on high alert. So at worst, U.S. defenses are driving developments that result in more threats and risks, and at best, they provide domestic justifications in Russia and China for those developments. So while the rationale for the ABM withdrawal and the construction of the ground-based Midcourse system was strictly a defense against a limited threat, against a few missiles from countries such as North Korea or Iran, the current and planned missile defense systems really go far beyond what is needed for that defense. The most recent policy of the Trump administration, the Missile Defense Review, came out in January, and that's the statement of the Trump administration's sort of point of view. And that document endorsed significant expansions of existing missile defense systems, including the ground-based one. There's a sea-based one, and some new ideas for drone-based missile defenses and space-based missile defenses. In fact, the president, in his remarks introducing the release of this document, said, our aim is to be able to defend against any missile from anywhere at any time. So that is not a strictly limited North Korea-facing policy. Indeed, in that missile defense policy, the Chinese and Russian development of systems designed to overcome ballistic missile defenses, like the hypersonics, like the underwater drone, they are framed as new threats that we must counter with new defenses. And we're playing out that same action-reaction cycle that the ABM Treaty was meant to circumvent. It's playing out a little bit slower, but it's playing out. One of the new initiatives that's particularly destabilizing is the program to build space-based missile defense interceptors. So this does harken back to the Reagan Star Wars ideas. Space-based missile defense hadn't been a Pentagon favorite, hadn't been appearing in budget requests for a decade. And expert advice, such as from the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering, who studied this in 2012, concluded that this defense would be enormously expensive. So for example, a space-based missile defense that could defend against one or two North Korean missiles would require 650 orbiting satellites. It would cost $300 billion in 2010 dollars. That would be the largest, or just possibly the second largest military program of all time. So enormously, enormously expensive. So the expense, of course, is not the most challenging part of this. It would be vulnerable to being overwhelmed. I'm going to show a short video at the end of this that explains this a little bit better. It also provides a potent anti-satellite weapon. And so I do only have a short time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I wanted to explain the interaction between Space Force, space weapons, and missile defenses. So this is just an image showing the curve of a low Earth orbiting satellite at 1,000 kilometers. So that's the blue curve there. That's where satellites such as those, that map the Earth. You might see Google images of your hometown, or they provide weather prediction, stuff like that. That's where those types of satellites are. And that yellow curve is the path of a 10,000 kilometer ICBM, so something that would go from North Korea to the US. You can see they're sort of in the same part of space, and they actually move at similar speeds. So missile defenses that are targeted at ICBMs are also generally potent anti-satellite weapons. So why is that something that we should be concerned about? And of course, the U.S. has tested missile defense interceptors against satellites. Did that in 2008, China did that in 2007, and India did the same just 2 weeks ago. Satellites are important for national security reasons. Many important functions such as nuclear command and control, intelligence and surveillance, navigation, secure global communications, these all go through space. And satellites are inherently difficult to protect. So the proliferation of missile defense interceptors might provide capability, a very limited capability to, I hit my limit, to defend against missiles, but they're also very likely to be very potent anti-satellite interceptors. So this is just a sense of who in the world is invested in space. So the first frame is what the world looked like 50 years ago, and it was really the province of the Soviet Union and the United States. But today, more than 70 countries have satellites. Almost everybody benefits from satellite-based services. And they've become increasingly strategically and economically important. So what do we do about this? I know I wanted to leave you with, I spend the time framing how big a problem this is. We don't have a large sense of awareness. What we do at UCS, and what you can do too, is to make sure you tell the truth when they lie. They say the system protects us, we should be able to do these attacks, we should spend hundreds of billions of dollars. We say, no. We have been cultivating congressional champions, spending our time in DC trying to find people who might be able to hold the purse strings, create better policies, of course, We shape the narrative, try to take every opportunity to get the point of view that that defenses can be risky every place that we can. And we created this video, which is 2 minutes, and I've run out of my time, so maybe I can just send you, should I play it? Is it too much? Yeah. I can send out the link. Yeah, if we have time. It's short. In answer to that excellent question about how to start using our social media and more creative approaches, this was one experiment we did. Anyway, thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Kelsey is director of the Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she provides research and analysis on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on nuclear security issues.
All right, thank you so much all for coming out today, and my thanks to Jay and NJIT for hosting this. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just to let you know, I do not have a PowerPoint. I think I overdosed on PowerPoint in graduate school and have not yet recovered. So I'm just going to speak from here. And what I'm really going to do today is to shift the conversation towards the threats posed by the spread of nuclear weapons, which really every president since Truman has recognized and sought to prevent. And over the past 7 decades, we've seen the United States invest in a number of strategies and mechanisms in order to prevent additional states from acquiring nuclear weapons. Of course, the most well-known of these exists within the legal construct, the pursuit of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which established the norm against states developing nuclear weapons. But there have been a number of other strategies as well. And we've seen the United States work multilaterally with other countries to try and prevent the spread of the technologies that are relevant to developing nuclear weapons. We've seen the United States extend the security of its nuclear weapons, extend its deterrent to allies such as NATO, such as Japan and South Korea, in part to disincentivize them from pursuing nuclear weapons. And we've seen the United States cooperate with other countries when it's become necessary to try and coerce or pressure countries that have pursued nuclear weapons programs illicitly to bring them back into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and persuade them to abandon illicit nuclear weapons programs. So if we look at this sort of holistically, U.S. non-proliferation efforts have largely been a success. In concert, of course, with the international community and international non-proliferation efforts. And together, in sum, these efforts have contributed to decisions by countries like Brazil and Argentina to abandon nuclear weapons programs. They played a role in creating an environment in which South Korea, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, voluntarily gave up their nuclear weapons. And the United States, in working with other countries, helped create the conditions in which to pressure states, like Iran, to negotiate on its nuclear weapons program. So if we look at what's happened really since Obama took office, he took office really with two principal proliferation threats that still the international community faced, Iran and North Korea. North Korea, of course, had already tested nuclear weapons at that point, had developed missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons within the region. And then we had Iran. Iran clearly had violated its international commitments to the NPT and had illicitly pursued nuclear weapons up until 2003. And what we know about Iran's initial plans for its nuclear weapons program was that it was designing a very small program. It intended to produce perhaps 6 nuclear weapons, largely keep them secret, and really only bring them out if they felt like the security of the state was threatened. So this was not a program that was designed for coercive capabilities, but really based on Iran's sense of security kind of within the region and protecting what it viewed as its territorial integrity from other threats. So when Obama took office, in confronting these threats, he largely drew on these strategies that had been developed over the past several decades to try to bring both Iran and North Korea back into good standing within the NPT. And in the Iranian case, he was largely successful. Beginning in 2008, Obama really prioritized adding additional sanctions pressure on Iran, working with the international community to garner support for additional sanctions, and to devise a diplomatic strategy that demonstrated to Iran that it could negotiate on its nuclear program and in return receive sanctions relief. So along with the Europeans, Russia and China, this group known as the P5+1 negotiated what was a very strong deal from a non-proliferation perspective that was finalized in 2015. And essentially what this agreement was a transactional approach to non-proliferation. It traded restrictions on Iran's nuclear program and increased monitoring, including continuous surveillance of most of Iran's nuclear facilities, increased access for inspectors. Under the deal, inspectors can visit any site in Iran if there are concerns about illicit nuclear activity in exchange for sanctions relief. So from a non-proliferation perspective, this was a strong deal. It brought Iran back into compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it created an avenue by which Iran could continue to pursue a civilian nuclear program, again, which countries are afforded to sort of under the NPT. So in the Iran case, we again saw the successful application of non-proliferation policy under the Obama administration. North Korea, on the other hand, I would say that the Obama administration's approach was significantly less successful, although it tried to draw on some of these same tools. If we look at where North Korea was in terms of its nuclear development before Obama took office, North Korea had tested a nuclear device, as I said. They had been developing the missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons kind of within the region, and they had in the past engaged in negotiations both with the United States in the 90s and multilaterally beginning from about 2003 to 2009 in an attempt to try to rein in their nuclear weapons program and again bring them back into compliance with their NPT obligations. So they had a history of negotiations that in some ways demonstrated some successes, some willingness to negotiate. If you look at North Korea's record of compliance with the agreement reached in 1993, sort of known as the Agreed Framework, North Korea actually stopped producing fissile material for nuclear weapons for nearly a decade. And it was in part the U.S. failure to deliver on its commitments under that deal, to come through with fuel oil shipments, to come through on nuclear cooperation, on proliferation-resistant reactors, that in part contributed to the downfall of that agreement. Of course, also we had John Bolton, who then took office within the Bush administration after Bush took office, who essentially also used North Korea's illicit production of uranium to kill the deal. So Obama essentially was facing a situation in 2008 in which North Korea was accelerating its nuclear program. It had demonstrated a willingness to negotiate in the past, but it had a significant distrust of sort of the U.S. position when it came to actually fulfilling its commitments, and it had a significant concern about U.S. credibility. So Obama attempted a similar approach to Iran, to increase the pressure on North Korea, ideally to bring them back to the negotiating table. But where this approach, I think, fell short in the North Korean case is that North Korea was really less responsive to the pressure that, in a different way that Iran was. Iran was a country that cared about its standing in the international community. It felt the sanctions bite. And it had elected a leader in 2013 in Hassan Rouhani that valued bringing the country back into good standing, and it valued the idea that Iran could reestablish sort of its preeminence in the region and reestablish its diplomatic relationships. So there you had some bargaining room and some space to actually pursue this transactional arrangement. North Korea, on the other hand, has really demonstrated much less willingness to negotiate from a transactional perspective. And that's really, I think, what stymied the Obama administration's approach in 2008 through the end of their administration, was that they were offering incentives to North Korea, but not a transformation in the relationship with North Korea. And that really is what North Korea is, I think, clearly seeking, that they will only give up their nuclear weapons if they see the threat posed by the perception of the threat posed by the United States and South Korea as decreasing. And that was not something that the Obama administration really articulated within its approach to North Korea. So if we look at sort of where nonproliferation efforts ended up at the end of the Obama administration, it appeared that sort of the last remaining proliferation threat, the last state that may kind of cross the threshold into developing nuclear weapons, Iran, that problem really had been dealt with the negotiation of the nuclear deal and Iran's adherence to that agreement. So it appeared that the number of nuclear-armed states was going to be capped at 9 and remain so. And this led to a lot of speculation that that sort of the non-proliferation threat really was over, that we didn't have any additional risks posed by states pursuing nuclear weapons. And actually, intelligence community assessments from around the 2016 era indicated that there were no additional states that were seeking to pursue nuclear weapons. So this kind of, I think, led to some complacency in the idea that sort of we succeeded in nonproliferation, that there weren't going to be any additional states kind of trying to join this club. Now, that is sort of the situation that we saw kind of going into the Trump administration, really that North Korea was sort of this remaining kind of threat. It seemed kind of impervious to some of the traditional strategies of trading pressure for nuclear restrictions, and likely just to remain a state that possessed nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future. Trump, however, as we've seen, has deviated significantly from traditional nonproliferation policy, both in his approach and in his rhetoric. We've seen Trump talk openly about additional states acquiring nuclear weapons, including allies. We've seen him abandon the nuclear agreement with Iran, a deal which was functioning, a deal which international inspectors and the intelligence community have repeatedly said that Iran is abiding by. And we've seen him fault the deal, fault the nonproliferation value of the deal as the reason for returning, when it's clear his rhetoric surrounding Iran is really about regime change for that country. So in addition to that, the Trump administration has failed to condemn Saudi Arabia's loose talk about pursuing nuclear weapons and has appeared willing to sell nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia without adequate monitoring and verification. Additionally, we've seen the Trump administration approach North Korea with conflicting messages about its end goals for negotiations with that country that again caused some conflict within the continuity of U.S. nonproliferation policy and have raised questions truly about whether or not the United States intends to engage in good faith negotiations to actually reduce the North Korean nuclear threat and ultimately roll it back. Now, if we look at this combination of rhetoric and approach, it can be very easy to say that Trump is just a deviation, a blip on the radar, and that continuity from past policy will carry us through in 2021, ideally if we have elected a new president, that we'll be able to go back to some of these strategies that we pursued pre-2016, and that again, largely we won't see new proliferation threats emerging. And I think that that's a very dangerous approach because we can't view the proliferation risk within a vacuum. And if we look also at other elements of the international security environment that are changing, I think we're likely to see, or we risk seeing new proliferation threats emerge, or situations that we had deemed resolved, like as Iran, have come back post-2021 that the next U.S. president will have to address. Because in addition to Trump's inconsistent rhetoric on proliferation, we've seen Trump question the value of alliances. Again, there are discussions in South Korea and Japan right now by a small minority about the idea of pursuing nuclear weapons for their own strategic purposes. And if the U.S. extended deterrent, if the U.S. security alliance is brought into question, it only fuels additional conversations and speculation in those states that one day they may pursue nuclear weapons. So in addition to that, we have an increased interest in nuclear energy, again with some states refusing to accept these more stringent monitoring and verification provisions. There's increasing frustration over the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the failure of states to meet their disarmament commitments. And the U.S. has lost significant credibility in its ability in negotiating when it comes to nuclear weapons issues, not just because of the irresponsible decision to pull out of the nuclear deal with Iran, but also just given how the United States has approached arms control treaties with Russia and other international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord. In addition to these changing environmental constraints that might make it more likely that a state would wish to pursue nuclear weapons, the technology to build nuclear weapons is also becoming easier to obtain. It's becoming, looking at sort of emerging tech, things like 3D printing, in combination, a lot of this bringing together a situation in which some of the traditional controls designed to prevent technologies used for nuclear weapons are becoming less effective, and evasion techniques and open source information more valuable in terms of actually pursuing that approach. So in short, I think we cannot assume that once we reach 2021 that we'll be able to to revert back to where we were in 2016, where there really are no sort of new emerging non-proliferation threats. And I think we also may need to question the idea that this transactional approach to nonproliferation will continue to be effective. And we may not be able to rely on this idea that if we build enough international pressure, that we might be able to then trade that pressure for constraints on a country's nuclear program. And so what I think as we look towards 2021 to think about more effective policy, we need to be shifting our thinking away from these transactional ideas for dealing with nuclear proliferation risks to an approach that's more transformative. And a transformative approach would retain some of these strategies in terms of trying to prevent the export of certain technologies, in terms of trying to provide security assurances. But it would also look at the root causes that really drive states to pursue nuclear weapons in the first place. For instance, thinking about Iran sort of post-2021, ideally, the remaining parties to the deal and Iran will be able to cobble together sort of enough economic relief that Tehran will continue to abide by the deal, and that the United States will then be able to re-enter the agreement. But if we look at Iran's situation and its context in the region, a number of the factors that drove it to pursue nuclear weapons in the first place remain unchanged. And if anything, they've been exacerbated by the Trump administration. So looking to 2021, we need a presidential candidate who will not only re-enter the deal, but try to embed the concept of building on the nuclear agreement within the idea of kind of transforming the conditions in the region that led Iran to pursue these nuclear weapons in the first place. And that includes considering options like rethinking our arms sales to Saudi Arabia and Israel, rethinking the missile defenses that we sell to these states that drive Iran to pursue more advanced missile systems. It might even involve trying to come up with mechanisms for security dialogue within the region. Again, adding to this non-proliferation deal concepts and ideas that would eliminate those motivating factors that might push Iran back down the path to pursuing nuclear weapons. Similarly, I think with North Korea, again, we cannot simply view pursuing a deal with North Korea that eliminates its nuclear weapons or reduces nuclear risks as transactional. I mean, North Korea has made very clear in its decision to engage in diplomacy in 2018 and now into 2019 that it's only willing to denuclearize in the context of a broader shift in the U.S.-North Korean relationship. And despite Trump agreeing to that at Singapore in 2018, that we would pursue denuclearization and a transformation of the relationship simultaneously, the U.S. has retained a singular focus on steps to denuclearize North Korea, which it must take first before the United States will address North Korea's security concerns. So again, emphasizing that transactional approach as opposed to the transformational approach that North Korea clearly is interested in, that might then create the security conditions in which North Korea would actually be willing to take these steps to first roll back its nuclear weapons program and then ultimately give up its nuclear weapons. So if we can get to 2021, I think rethinking this idea of how we approach nonproliferation agreements, trying to shift from a transactional approach to a transformational approach to address those root causes, I think could stand a better chance of success and ensuring in the long term that these states don't return to, that states like Iran don't return to pursuing nuclear weapons, and that other states down the road, if they are motivated to do so, that we're addressing not just the symptoms, but also the cause of that approach. Now, just briefly, I don't want everyone to think that nothing positive can happen on nonproliferation until 2021. So just to leave you perhaps with a few kind of near-term ideas and action areas, there are a few things that I think are particularly important now. And there's not a lot of legislation relating to North Korea and Iran within Congress right now, but I think it's still critical to send messages to representatives and senators about the importance of voicing support for the United States re-entering the nuclear deal with Iran in 2021. A number of Democratic candidates have already said that they would rejoin the JCPOA unconditionally in 2021. I think that's positive. The senator from the state of New Jersey who is running is not yet one of them. So certainly weighing in with him, encouraging him to make a similar pledge, that's important. It sends a signal to Iran that there is a prospect for the U.S. returning to the deal that would be very positive. Similarly, and be positive and ideally encourage Iran to continue meeting its commitments despite the U.S. having withdrawn from the deal and reimposed sanctions. On the North Korean side, again, just weighing in with members of Congress in support of diplomacy, I think is quite critical. It may seem evident from those choosing to come to a conference like this on a Sunday that negotiations stand the only chance for actually reducing the risk posed by North Korea's nuclear program. But there's been somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction in Washington to Trump's engagement with North Korea. And we can criticize Trump's approach, we can criticize his process, we can criticize the mixed messages that he has sent to the North Koreans. All of those are areas where we certainly need to see improvement. But certainly the idea of engaging in negotiations, the idea of trying to sort of trade U.S. inducements for North Korean actions to reduce and roll back its nuclear program, that is something where I think we should give Trump credit for being willing to engage in talks, and he should be receiving the support from the U.S. Congress, which he currently isn't. And there is a real risk that if these negotiations fall apart, that Trump will kind of return to this fire and fury rhetoric that characterized 2017, where North Korea was testing missiles. Trump was responding with loose talk that really risked escalation to conflict within that period. So providing support for diplomacy, underscoring that it's critical that the United States try to stay the course of this process and to engage in effective diplomacy, I think are messages that Congress needs to hear and that Congress then needs to voice in support to the President. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Kelsey. We're running over time. We have time for just a couple of questions.
Yes, I'm Alfred Meyer from Physicians for Social Responsibility. A question perhaps for Ms. Gronlund. The NATO, the nuclear weapons in NATO countries I'm wondering if there are any plans to get them out of any of those countries, like Turkey or maybe even Italy, but Turkey's clearly the one where the political upheaval and circumstances are very uncertain. So I'm just wondering if there are any contingency plans in existence.
I actually don't know, but it's possible they have been removed from Turkey
Thank you.
for obvious reasons.
Hello, my name's Amy Fast. I'm here through the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I think all of you mentioned space-based nuclear weapons. And as far as I know, there is still a UN treaty on the peaceful uses of outer space. And I wonder if that has any effect on what's allowed.
Not space-based nuclear weapons, space-based weapons that would shoot down nuclear weapons. But I'm going to let Laura.
Yes, so you're very right that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 forbids the stationing of nuclear weapons in space or on any other celestial bodies. It is silent on other types of weapons, so a space-based missile defense interceptor is not explicitly outlawed by the treaty.
It's on the peaceful uses of outer space, because that sounds a lot wider than just nuclear weapons.
It does. So the peaceful uses of outer space is a phrase in the preamble of the treaty, so it sets out the basic principles by which space is meant to be used. And there are pieces of the treaty that would be relevant. Actors are meant to use it with due regard to other countries' peaceful uses of space. And explicitly, all international law applies in space, so the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, arms control treaties, etc. But I haven't seen a legal analysis that supports on a legal basis that the Outer Space Treaty would keep space-based missile defenses out. That's something that would need to be addressed by a separate set of norms or treaties.
Thank you.
My name is Joanne Dufour from the Unitarian Universalist UN office. I was just questioning about Korea and the possibility of eliminating all nuclear weapons, and whether or not that means the American weapons in South Korea in any of the activities that are going on.
So the U.S. removed weapons from South Korea in 1991, but concern about U.S. nuclear weapons in the region and U.S. personnel that are trained on nuclear weapons in South Korea is part of what North Korea wants discussed when it talks about denuclearization. And that's been a critical point that has caused talks has contributed to the stalemate in negotiations between the United States and North Korea, is this difference in understanding what denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula actually means. I mean, the United States has made clear that this term, which was agreed to in Singapore, constitutes not only the North Korean nuclear weapons, their means of production, and their delivery systems, but also their chemical and biological weapons. Whereas North Korea defines denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula very differently to include U.S. nuclear weapons in the region, U.S. nuclear threats, and U.S. personnel in South Korea trained on nuclear weapons. So again, kind of the United States, in thinking about more holistically about sort of its policy towards North Korea, I think has to give a clearer indication of what it's willing to put on the table in terms of its force posture in the region, in terms of security assurances for North Korea, and exactly what that configuration looks like. And to date, the Trump administration has really been unwilling to do so. So as a result, it's still not clear what the scope of this process is. And as we fail to, and if sides, I think, fail to kind of agree upon the scope, I think it will be difficult to progress in the negotiations much further than we have come today.
Okay, so my question kind of builds on that. So we've seen the destructive power of nuclear weapons in general, and there's a lot of talk about not being the first to strike. How is it that we don't ban this weapon outright? Why is it no talk about that? Because we've already banned bioweapons we've seen which are deadly and it's terrifying, and why is this not an issue for? Because this would help, stop the Koreans building from weapons or any other countries, because the rest of the world would be against new development. So,
But I would absolutely agree that that type of transformation in terms of thinking and security is what we need, and it would be beneficial to the Korean region.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it'd be more than just Korea, because any future development would just be stopped right there.
Yeah.
But
Okay, thank you very much, Lisbeth, Laura, and Kelsey.
Wonderful speakers. I'm so glad to see your stuff here.